Our guest author tonight is Adnan Khan. He's a novelist, essayist, and screenwriter. He has been nominated for the National Magazine Award and was awarded the 2016 RBC Taylor Emerging Writer Award. His debut novel, There Has to Be a Knife, was named a Best Canadian Novel of 2019 by the CBC. His film work includes co-writing the screenplay Shook for Scarborough Pictures, and his non-fiction has been published in the Globe and Mail, Maisonneuve, among others. He has taught non-fiction at the University of Guelph and is the fiction editor at Puritan magazine. Our moderator tonight is Anne Y.K. Choi. She is a writer, educator, and co-founder of the Authors Book Club. Her novel, Kay's Lucky Coin Variety, was the Toronto Book Awards finalist and one of CBC Books' 12 Best Canadian Debut Novels of 2016. Anne's children's book, Once Upon an Hour, will be released this fall of 2020. She lives in Toronto. Welcome, everybody.
This heads up for anyone who has not had a chance to read it. It's an intense novel, right? The themes, addiction, alienation, suicide, poverty, and everything in between. Do you want to just begin by telling us a little bit about your novel?
Yeah, I think it started off like that. Yeah, wanting to explore this sort of main character and the way he moved through the world. I mean, those different dimensions of character that, sort of make sense, the way things happen to you, but also the spaces that you are in and how the world fluctuates around that. So I wanted to have a really sort of strong presence in the middle of that because that made the most sense to sort of attract these issues, if that makes any sense.
Right. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about Omar, your main character, without giving away everything?
Yeah, I mean, he starts off in the book, he's around 27 years old, he works as a line cook, and one of the things I really wanted to explore was the impact of long-term relationships when you're young, because we sort of forget that the mid-20s, early 20s are quite formative in a lot of emotional ways, in a way that, your teenage years, which is what we normally associate with sort of coming-of-age stories, are. So I kind of wanted to explore that impact of what it would mean to not only come across like this really weird 10-year relationship for these two unstable personalities, but then also in a way, the first sort of tangible sign in a way of adulthood is, funerals and death. And that's when you start dealing with these things in like a sort of quote unquote adult way.
Right.
So yeah, the book starts out, the inciting event for the book is that his ex-girlfriend's father gives him a phone call and lets him know that his ex-girlfriend has committed suicide, and that sort of begins this unraveling process where he starts to question how exactly he was involved in her life and what exactly he meant to her.
Right. One thing that I'm always very mindful of is the physical attributes of our settings and how characters interact with their surroundings, and having them, notice the sensory details in a very natural way. I think a sense of place is very important because you kind of create a foundation from which all your characters are anchored. I think you did a phenomenal job of setting up Toronto as I think if the subject matter was not as quite heavy, I would have actually wanted to have students map this place, right? It's so tell me a little bit of what you were thinking when you were putting the story together in terms of yours, because truly the places you name and in Koreatown and like all of these things really bring the story alive.
Yeah, that's something that kind of surprised me, like the how that's resonated with people. When I was working on the book, there were a few people that sort of suggested that maybe I don't do it because Toronto isn't as well known as sort of the literary cities, right? So London and New York are the cities that you're really allowed to talk about a lot in terms of getting down to those nitty-gritty details of street names and things like that. But, for a book that's written in first person present, it doesn't really make any sense for having him wander through the city without mentioning things. So in terms of that those grounding details of where he's going and almost that sense of mapping, which is what I wanted to do, It just, the content sort of followed the form, right? You couldn't have this character from that perspective walking through without saying these things. So it wasn't really a conscious decision in the sense that I wanted to map the city or show anything about the city, but it sort of was just like, well, if you're going to do first person present, you know, you're very heavily there with him. So that's how he's going to navigate the world. So it kind of just became, I don't want to say an afterthought, but it just made sense to me. It wasn't really something that I spent too much time thinking about. And of course, you know, from like the thing that people said to me the most was that people won't recognize it. But of course, you know, like I've spent some time in New York and London, but I don't recognize everything that goes on there. It's fine. You know, it's not a huge leap to understand that someone is in Koreatown. The name sort of explains itself. So I wasn't too worried about that.
I'm kind of surprised that was some of the feedback you got, because Toronto is such a recognizable cosmopolitan, I would think, city on the world map. So
I think there's an older generation that still views Toronto from a very Commonwealth perspective, you know, from a very British perspective, that doesn't understand that there's sort of, especially in the last 20, 25 years, a carving out, mostly because culturally they're not part of it. So I think that's the sort of cultural gap there.
Which actually then leads me to ask, what role does your identity have in your writing?
Again, that's one of those questions that I get a lot, but it's so hard to decipher because, you know, that identity is the framework within which I operate. So for me, it's not something I can necessarily see. Like I can analyze it and can understand, you know, the borders of it, but that's just the perspective that I've been gifted through which I interact with the world. So it's almost like a literary tool. You know, you have to interact with the world with a set of circumstances. And so this is mine. And so you use those things to navigate almost as a compass when you're existing. So I think it makes sense that when you're trying to tell a story, you move through those same things because there are universal. I think that's the thing that gets lost a lot in this quote unquote diverse literature field, is that these things are just tools to access, again, quote unquote, universal themes that certain demographics have, you know, apparent access to that certain demographics don't. So I really think it's just like viewing it like that, I think.
Just before we officially started, we were talking about the cover design of the book and your relationship with the editor and the publisher. Did you want to just share some of the background work in this book?
Yeah, so for the cover, I had a great experience with Oliver McPartlin, who was the previous designer at Arsenal. If you look at a lot of their book covers from the last few years, you'll notice sort of a similarity with the bold typefaces and things like that. And we had a great experience. I basically just emailed him and let him know a lot of the inspirations and thoughts that were going through my head. So I was thinking very visually, so in the sense of colors, and I referenced some paintings and things like that. And he was able to sort of come back with a set of images. And we worked sort of collaboratively on that, but he certainly did all the heavy lifting. I just sort of rambled on to him, but he's a great designer.
And the title?
The title, you know, it just came to me. I spent a lot, the title was one of the last things I think I put together before I sent the workbook out to submission.
So this is your title, you got to choose.
Yeah, it is my title. There were a couple questions about it, but yeah, at the end of the day, I did get to choose it.
Where's Fiona? Fiona, remember we talked about who gets to choose their titles and who doesn't? And okay, just off the record, it seems like most male authors we have spoken to got to keep their titles. And so far, I don't know, Fiona, how many women got to keep their titles? I don't know. Okay, that's a side conversation we'll have at a later date.
Wow. I mean, yeah, like it wasn't even really a process. Like my editor sort of inquired about the title and she poked a little bit at it. But there wasn't any pushback or anything like that where, you know, it wasn't even, so speaking from my very particular male experience, there was no sort of hesitancy about the title.
Interesting. At some point when we turn over, I'd be interested to hear others' thoughts on, and then what about your working relationship with your editor? Like, is this the story you wanted to tell, or did anything change over the course of the editorial process?
No, I again, like, I can't say enough good things about Arsenal. So, you know, before I signed on with them, I had a long phone chat with Brian Lamb and Shira Rose Walensky, who are the publisher and editor there, and sort of just made sure we were on the same page. When I sold the manuscript, I knew that there was work to be done, at least 2 drafts, and I wanted to sell it to someone that was going to help me achieve what I wanted to achieve. And I think that's one of the benefits of working with a small press, is that you get to really hone that fine line down, and making sure that your vision is honored. And Shira Rose, who's my editor, was spectacular. We were really aligned in a lot of things. She really pushed me in a lot of ways, especially with this draft. I had a lot of structural difficulties, and so she sort of caught onto that quite quickly, and was able to really sort of hone in on what I wanted. So yeah, she was really great.
And before I turn the questions over to everyone else, just a question about this book has received so much praise, right? Like every time I turn around, it's on a list. CBC books, some are recommended. So could I just ask, how have you been since the release? Because I know, speaking with other authors, there's a lot of courses for authors who want to write, right? So you could take 1,000 creative writing courses. But, and again, this is a conversation I was having with David, is there's really no course for life after you publish, right? And having to, just, it's learning by trial and error. But how have you been processing all this, the praise and the everything moving forward? Has anything unexpected happened, or anything that you're willing to share with us?
Nothing unexpected. I mean, in the sense that, caught me totally out of left field. I mean, obviously there were things, obviously praise is great. I was self-aware enough going into it to know that I have a massive ego, and that I just sort of had to really just steady myself, to make sure that I stayed, straight on the course. So I sort of tried to spend a lot of time developing a healthy approach to criticism and praise, which is really that, again, you are trying to work on something that honors your personal vision. And I really believe that if you're going to take every item of praise that comes your way and treat it seriously, then you also have to treat all the negative attention as seriously. So at the end of the day, you are trying to work on something that's personal to you, and you have to stay true to that. And it's great that people love the book, and it's great that, it's always really heartwarming when people respond to it. And I've been really happy with the fact that some of the major reviews have all kind of honed in on something different, which I was really happy with, that everyone seemed to be attracted to a different aspect of the work. But yeah, it's just a process of sort of humbling yourself daily, which is great.
Excellent. In fact, I actually, I'll read one of the blurbs. Your book is, quote, a raw, gritty, shiver-inducing, but very readable account of a young man in a spiral of grief and self-destruction. So I hope that's enough to hook anybody who is wanting to check out this book.
It starts, quite personal, about Omar, and then it seems to branch out from what I've read and get sort of a larger kind of scale. Was that intentional going into the writing, or was that just the sort of naturally over the course of the writing?
It sort of just happened. One of the things that I'm really attracted to is that crime fiction private eye trope where someone starts one thing and then just starts getting into trouble, and it just starts snowballing, and it starts becoming kind of unwieldy for them. So I really enjoyed that. So as I was drafting it, I wanted to find a way to, as you said, make it a little bit wider in scope. Start off really small, and then start as he sort of, goes on this quest. So throughout the book, the thing that sort of ties it together is that he's looking for his ex-girlfriend, or he assumes that his ex-girlfriend has left him a suicide note. And because of the tensions with her family, he's not sure if he would normally have access to it. So the book is sort of set up in a quest where he's trying to find the note. So yeah, I wanted him to go from his very insular perspective to sort of scoping out into the wider world like that.
As the reader in the group, one of the things that fascinated me was the incredible range of your writing, from nonfiction to screenwriting, and then obviously fiction. And I I guess I'm wondering, how did you traverse all these different paths? Do you have a particular favorite? Are you picking up poetry next week? And especially, I'm very interested in the idea of screenplay, because you talk in you just alluded in the book to the, your decisions around the cover, and talking about art in there. And I'm wondering if even though you're a writer, if you have strong visual cues or inspirations.
Yeah, the different like sort of types of writing thing it's not been something I've ever formally thought of. It's just something I've done. Starting to when I was a very like sort of younger writer, I just wrote what I wanted to, and ideas come to me with the suggestion of what form they'll be in. So like when I think of something, I already know if it's going to be an essay or if it's going to be a story. I am lately finding that I'm struggling with nonfiction. I'm not, but because a lot of the bulk of my earlier career was nonfiction, so I think maybe that's something I'm cycling through. As to whether I'm a visual person, I mean, I certainly look to visuals for inspiration. In terms of output, in terms of rendering anything visual, I'm not the greatest, but I do. I love looking at things and sort of just understanding how they sort of fit into like the wider composition. It's something that every day baffles me, like looking at just colors and just being able to see that, it's like being a child, but it's, you're kind of just amazed that these things are there. So that's something certainly that I feel, because I think mood is really easily expressed in visuals a little bit more so than in language. But yeah.
Someone is asking, does writing exhaust you or energize you? Oh, that's a great question.
It exhausts me. Yeah, it's like super mentally draining. Yeah, that's what I'll say about that. It's the way I always describe it is it's not fun, but it's fulfilling. Like I don't really have fun doing it. And it can be a drag to get to the desk some days, but I do find that, whether it's half an hour, 2 hours, whatever you can manage. I mean, if you're working with sort of imagery that matters to you, that is sort of emotionally relevant to you, it's going to be a little bit draining, because a lot of the time you don't really know what you're doing. And, you're also dealing with multiple voices in your head. Like you're dealing with that creative voice, but you're also dealing with self-criticism. You're also dealing with whatever outside influences are there. And even if you can't hear them all at once, they are there sort of battling it out. So it is kind of an exhausting ordeal. Like I remember being 14 and my dad telling me to be an accountant, and I wish that I'd listened to him.
Yeah. So then may I ask, how do you self-care? Like how do you take care of yourself?
I don't really do a lot of good self-care. I will say that. I know it's in vogue, but I don't, I just sort of live, and I don't sometimes, I have a sweet tooth, so I count that as self-care, but that's about it.
What was the most challenging or difficult thing about writing other characters, especially characters of the opposite sex?
I always find writing other characters very difficult. Again, mostly because of that I perspective, right? In a novel, like you're supposed to have some insight into the other characters. But then when you go back to the question of I, and that's the consciousness, how does that consciousness know anything about the other consciousness? So there's the rules of the novel that dictate, well, you have to let some light into the other characters in the novel. But then the I itself is saying, well, that person only knows what they're hearing. So that's a very convoluted answer because I don't really know. I'm still struggling with it. I find it really difficult. I don't like writing in third person. I don't really, it's not something I've gotten used to yet. I shouldn't say I don't like writing in it, but it's not something I've really gotten a handle on. But I find it difficult, not necessarily because of the opposite sex, but I guess you have to consider those frameworks, right? Like, what is the reality of that person and how does that get expressed? And that's quite a difficult question.
I think you maybe have also alluded to this earlier when you talked about structure, but I just wanted to know what for you is still the most challenging aspect of the writing process. Is it plot mechanics? Is it finding your voice? It is characterization. What do you think are the things that you do well and the things that you also need to work on more?
I think the hardest thing is just pulling it all together, really, right? Like you're trying to take something that when you're drafting, you're kind of cerebral about it, you're analytic about it, and you're trying to pull it together in a way that makes it super organic. And that can be really hard when you stared at a manuscript for so many years and things like that. So I love all those like little tricks of changing the font and things like that. I do all that shit because I think anything that makes it look different. The next thing I'm going to try is I just read an interview with Don DeLillo, and he puts only one paragraph per page. And then prints out the entire manuscript. So his manuscripts are like 2,000 pages because everything just has one paragraph. Because he believes that if you just look at one paragraph on a page, that visual, it allows you to sort of hone in on it more. So I'm going to do that next and probably lose my fucking mind. But I'll try that. But I think just pulling everything together, I find to be the most challenging thing because you kind of, you're like a magician. You don't want to show off your trick. But I do think, and I hope at least, that every project brings its own challenges, as when you sort of, I think I did gain a better understanding of structure working on this book. And this book has a very linear structure. The time is really it's almost daily that you go through it. So in my next project, I'd want to play with that a little bit and make sure that I, can push that and work with a different dynamic with time and how that relates to sort of understanding.
How can readers support you at this point? Like, we have this pandemic thing happening, but at the same time, do you have any upcoming events that you want to share, or what can we do as readers to support you moving forward?
Just buy the book for every single person you ever meet. That's it. 10 copies per person, I think, is a reasonable number. I have an event in Waterloo, but I think everything is online, so it's all comes together quite quickly and weirdly. But I think, I have an event in Waterloo in a few months, but that's about it. I'm starting to sort of turn back inwards to focus on some work. But I think the best way to support writers is to, things like this are great. To hear from readers is kind of an amazing experience. To hear from people that have connected with your work is not something I'd experienced before. And it is really weird, right? Like, this thing was in my brain and now it's a physical object and someone else read it and connected with it. And that is never going to be an experience that's not sort of extraordinary. So I think that's lovely.